Hello, everybody. I'm Charles Landry, and I just wish I was with you personally. It would be so much a better experience. So here I am, nevertheless, and I want to talk to you about psychology and the city, which I believe is a hidden dimension to what we really have in our cities. It's something that people don't explore enough. They just think it's something else. But I remember thinking through when I was asked to do this talk that it's got a substantial role in cultural policy making as well as placemaking. So let's look at this a bit more closely. Now, I remember a phrase that I read by Patrick Geddes, a biologist and an urbanist from a long way back, and he said, "A city is more than a place in space, it's a drama in time." And you can see this in this image of Venice that I took from some rooftop. And I was just thinking, what are all these people doing? What are they thinking? How do they relate to each other? But there are so many blind spots in good city making. One, of course, is that we don't really put a cultural perspective and cultural lens center stage. But another is the insights of psychology. Um, Another thing is, of course, that the city is primarily an emotional experience with psychological and cultural effects. You can see this when you just look at this artwork. There's just so much mirrors behind mirrors of mirrors and mirrors and so on. And we shape the city, of course, and the city shapes us. Or we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us, as Winston Churchill said. So we need to really see the city and feel the city through all of our senses, because it's the emotional, the sensory, and the psychological that creates the look and the feel and the atmosphere of a place. Think of this. This is Sao Paulo. Is this just lifeless concrete, or is there real urban life behind it, where people are living their daily lives, their loves, and all of that sort of thing? So the city is a sensory system. It has taste, touch, smell, sound. There's a look to it, of course. We can see things, we can feel it, and we can experience it. The city, of course, is also a cultural system. It's about our mindsets, our habits, our values, the skills we have, the likes we have, the behaviors, our dislikes too, of course, and our attitudes. So the city, therefore, is a communications device and communicates through every fiber of its being. Just think of this building. What does it say to us? It feels lifeless. It sort of pushes us away. You don't feel connected. Or this place in Trieste, which was a social experiment, but ended up as something that was really frightening, where people didn't want to live. And thank God, I hope, we're not building places like this that segment one part of a city from the other. And that's what placemaking, of course, is about. It's making places for people, or even this in Macau, the casino capital of the world, which is, what is it telling us? It's sort of imposing itself on us. Or here in Beijing, couldn't have this been made a bit more sensitive or attractive? And of course, even this seaside resort, where more that you see are cars rather than the beach. And of course, advertising is everywhere. Do I need to know that everything is about Coca-Cola? Or here in Denver, do I need an ad on the steps as I move from one place to the next? And of course, occasionally there is no entry, but does it need to be so big? So here we are, placemaking and psychological insight. It's actually, in my view, more than good urban design and cultural activation. It's about something much broader. And this is the entrance to Adelaide Airport, where you can see Aboriginal design blending with that more linear Western design. So I think that's more than just doing activities. It's actually thinking about places at a deeper level. It's also more than the happiness and well-being agenda. Of course, we want to feel good. We'd prefer probably to be happy than less happy, and so on. But why do we need psychology? And how can it help? Well, I think it makes the invisible visible. And that invisible is just potentially incredibly interesting, important, beautiful, but also tells us about some of our problems. So sometimes, if we don't make that invisible visible, we move away from each other and don't welcome each other and don't want to be together. So, what it's all about is these big words like meaning, purpose, and the integration of the various parts of our personality. So, place and purpose is the big thing in my view. And as we all know, culture is our meaning maker. That helps us create our own meaning. And that's why it relates, of course, to our identity, where we come from, who we are, where we might be going, and what we might do in the future. And I remember doing a talk here on a Theaster Gates project in a ruined church where you just had to say, what did you really feel? What were your deeper feelings? And just that context of this temporary building in a ruined church really made me feel deep, go deep, etc. So a deeper understanding of city dynamics is essential because it helps us understand what drives motivation, will, the success and failure of places. So in our minds, there's all stuff going on. Too much, probably, far too much. Occasionally, we need to empty it. And also, of course, the social media, the new world, of course, absorbs us in many, many ways and sometimes detaches us from ourselves. So this is psychology. I'm not really saying that we all need to go to a psychotherapist or anything, but just at least understand what it's about. But I also think we need to go deep because being a human urban species is actually not that very old. It's only, 2,000 years ago, there was hardly anyone living in places in cities, but we still carry that archaic mind, that mind from when we were perhaps more in nature with our fears and hopes and all of these responses. And we're now bringing that archaic mind into the city itself. And this is why I like artworks like this that shows us that suddenly things explode, which we didn't really think about. This is in Taipei. Or here, vegans will probably like this. Is a frightening picture from the Venice Biennale, which just reminds us there is this archaic mind too. So the soul and the city are really important things. The soulful city, or our soul in the city. Here it says City of Dreams in Manila. But what is this dream here? It's a casino they're building. So it's the opposite of, I think, the dream we really want. And historically, many of our dreams and aspirations have related, of course, to religion in various forms all across the world. And today, perhaps, it's less religion. Of course, religion is still widespread, but it's often the museum, the gallery, artistic projects that give us that sense of moving to a higher register, which is more meaningful and tells us something about ourselves and the world around us. And this is why I also like the Finnish pavilion in Venice, where somehow they've blended nature into the physical fabric, because that connection between us and nature has largely been lost. And of course, it needs to be reestablished again. And here, sometimes you can see it that you have to paint the nature because this environment is just not attractive enough. So that's the world we partly live in. And here, destroying things is also not a good idea in Taichung, in Taiwan, they destroyed a street, and then people protested and said, no, no, keep it. And then they just drew the buildings that were there before it was taken apart. And this has become a good gathering place. So seeing the urban fabric, city life, as simply empty shells, devoid of human psychological and cultural content, is clearly careless. And to be blind to its consequences, I believe, is foolish. So this metropolis, this is a famous picture, advertising Fritz Lang's Metropolis film, is really crucial. And it's ironic, as Jan Gale said, that we know more about the habitat of mountain gorillas than we do about the habitat of people. Here, all of these people, they're doing things. Here, they're clustered far too much. Perhaps this is a density that we don't want, but nevertheless, do we know what they all think and how they act? So that's why we, my colleague and I, Chris Murray, are so interested in the urban psyche. And that is the sort of complex personality that emerges from the interactions between people, place, and their cultures. So this is New York, of course, and it has a certain feel. But thank God they've created a viewing point, a gathering place where people can just look at the world, the water, the buildings, the lights, just go by. Or here in Paris. And you can see when you look closely, some people are talking, some are just reflecting, others, of course, are just looking at their mobiles. Or here in Helsinki, in Senate Square, you can see dotted around people doing things and just pondering on life, perhaps. So city and their psychology, just let's think. And you know your city so much better than me, although I've been to South Africa many times. Think of Joburg, Cape Town, Durban, and many other cities in South Africa. But also just remind yourself of places like Berlin. This Jewish memorial in the center of town says so much that we need to keep with us as we speak in this world with its dangers at this current moment. Or here in Lublin in Poland is an old building that's been left alone. It was owned some time by Jewish people, but you can see just pictures of the inhabitants who were probably murdered in the windows. It's very powerful. So there are many schools of psychology, and each has its own possibilities. And many of them are fighting with each other, saying, I'm more important than the other, you're more important, what you're saying is not relevant. That's not really so important. It's the collective knowledge that somehow lies within these different approaches to psychology that is really important, that we need to take into account. So if we just look a bit at the future, what can we see? We can see there is fragility. And in our world, we have to manage that fragility and the risk nexus that is increasingly developing in all sorts of ways. So what we've got is this fragility. Things can fall apart. And particularly that was the case in the pandemic. My local artist friend always puts up words, and he put up not lockdown, he put luck down there. But I prefer to have this image because it says perhaps there was an opportunity in that problem. Perhaps it reminded us of the things that really mattered. We all wore masks, perhaps we still wear masks, and we probably should still do that. But then there's all these other issues in the world that we need to address. Poverty, inequality, that's getting worse every day. And also, as it says here on this graffiti, the invisible children, the children, of course, who we want to have a happier life. And as you probably know, more younger people now think the world will be worse than that of their parents. So we have a big challenge in front of us. And one of them, of course, is to do with climate collapse and the need to deal with fossil fuels and perhaps have hydrogen cars and so on. And then there are, of course, is the war. And that is really frightening, particularly when you're so close to it here in Europe. So there is this fragility everywhere that we can see and feel. And then when we think of cities, this is in Zurich, they built a new hotel, the Renaissance Hotel. Everything is going to be great. Hey, the big companies are going to come in, the hip, the Googles and all of that of this world. But then one artist said, don't destroy my building, and put the word resistance there in the same typeface. Unfortunately, I've heard that this building has now been taken down. So that just reminds us of the relevance of resistance. Are things now so bad that we should resist? I saw this in Belgium where it said capitalism is chaos and anarchy is order. Now, whether that's true or not is perhaps less relevant, but is just a sharp reminder of the issues at stake. So this transformation, these big issues that we're talking about, is itself, of course, a cultural project. It's the biggest cultural project of our time because it's about, as I said earlier, values, mindset, habits, attitudes, and skills. But of course, as you know better than anyone, culture is not our operating system. It's often the thing that we say is the extra after everything else has been dealt with. But of course, it's the superior form of knowledge that explains to us why things are as they are. In other words, it's the other invisible hand that makes meaning, that creates life as we know it. And really, to address this in a proper way requires courage, perhaps moral courage. It certainly requires ethics. So the cultural project that I'm talking about is also about healing the divides. And I like this picture that I took in Penang, where three religions are sort of in posters there. In fact, it's a video and a record shop, but it doesn't matter. It just reminded me of the fact of how we bring our differences together in all our forms. And this reminds me that perhaps one part of the big project is civic generosity. Civic generosity is that which the public domain, public sector, gives back to the people who live in their places, and how this is then etched into the urban landscape. Like here in Portland, this is really saying, yes, we like you. We understand how you feel. We understand that nature and the physical needs to come together. And a lot of what this is about is really acting beyond the self. So if I am talking to people about the creative city idea, that in one sentence, a big book, one sentence is, in a world of dramatic change, how do you create the conditions to think, plan, and act with imagination to create opportunities and solve problems? But what I tend to then say is, if you're going to be a creative city, think of yourself as being the best creative city for the world. In other words, give back. Like this woman here in Frankfurt Airport who just offered me, others, a free hug. And of course, I gave her a hug and then said, do you mind if I take a photo of you? And she said, yes. So it's about finding opportunities for us to connect, to meet and talk together, to have that dialogue, the dialogue between differences in particular, given the polarizing world we are in. And I saw this bench in Umeå in the Arctic in Sweden, which was a European capital of culture, and it said, by sitting on this bench, I am open to conversations with a complete stranger. So that is the gift that we can give each other, that sense of generosity, that ability to talk to each other and have dialogue. And many of you will know that there's a Biennale Democrazia in Turin. And I think that's a good Biennale, not of art, not of design or anything like that, not of fashion, but of how we develop our democracy. And it still is going on every 2 years. So when we do that and we have democratic processes, when we are more empowered, we can give more of ourselves, we can also be heroes of some sort. And that reminds us that perhaps all of us need to wake up in some sense. And here, the question is, how do we then as a city become psychologically resilient and creatively resilient and culturally resilient? And how do we do that? So let's look at that for a moment. So Carol Riff says some interesting things about how people personally feel the best of themselves. And I've just translated this into city comments. So first, it's really about creating the condition for achieving people's potential so that they have a sense of ease and completeness. And here the physical environment plays an incredibly important part. Secondly, to provide environments that give us the ability to deal with difference and to find connection to each other. Thirdly, creating places that allow people to have the courage to reflect their own convictions. So you're aligned with who you feel you are and what you're doing and how you're able to behave with other people. Fourth, to nurture those deep-seated needs, including the connection to nature, which I've mentioned already. And fifthly, people feel at ease, and therefore I think cities feel at ease, if there's a self-awareness and a clarity and honesty about where the city is and where it wants to go, and particularly a drive in that city to help the citizens as a whole, to help each other and to be part of a single whole. And finally, how we can balance ourselves, and we're obviously often egotistical and so on, the social life around us, and to also avert some of our more tribal instincts. So a lot of what I'm talking about is clearly beyond the functional and the technical. And of course, these things are incredibly important. Buildings need to stand up. We need engineers. We need all of these people to do this well. But we also need to value the sensory. And this is just a playful thing that happened in Paris, putting this facade on a building whilst they were doing something behind it. So here's another example that you'll know, Anish Kapoor's Cloud Gate in Chicago, where people connect in ways that I've never really seen in a piece of art. It's wonderful. For those who know it, you will know how beautiful it is. For those who haven't been there, please go there. But you can even in commercial contexts find things that feel more whole. This is Galerie Lafayette in Paris, and that's just the roof. And again, it has that sort of sense of completion and roundedness. Or here, from the Venice Biennale again, this was the prize given to one of the artists. And in fact, it's the cafe of the Biennale. But it can also be just ordinary, well-designed public space, like here in Malaga, where you have the linear, but also the wavy and the curvy, which I think is satisfactory. And sometimes in places which are a bit insensitive, you can still, through color, like here in Kuala Lumpur, make a place feel better, feel more human scale. Because one of the big issues I've obviously talking about and is underlying everything I'm saying is that we need to have a human scale and be human centered. So here even, I like the fact that that horrible grey building has this rather colorful building next to it. And just reminds us that we can be imaginative in every type of context. This is perhaps completely crazy, but nevertheless, there's color in it. Perhaps not my thing, perhaps not your thing. It doesn't really matter. So what we're talking about is about changing places, changing the way we think of our time and how we use it, changing the way our thoughts work and our mindset. And all of that can perhaps change our future. So the constants in good city making, and I've tried to think about this over the years, what are the 5 main points that people think make great, creative, livable places and cities? It's really about anchorage and distinctiveness. It's about possibility and connection and potential. It's about communication. and it's about finding ways to nurture each other and to provide aspiration and inspiration. So, memory, of course, is very important in all of this. So, one of the beautiful things I think in thinking through heritage is that creativity is a renewable resource endlessly. Heritage is non renewable, but we can reinterpret it for today. So, heritage and innovation and creativity are partners. They can be great partners together. So the psychology test is something that my colleague Chris Murray and I developed. And so we're trying to therefore measure urban psyches. And we did this recently in Coventry. And thank God Coventry begins with a C, so we could say Coventry on the couch. And we brought in a psychotherapist with us to analyze the city, to treat the city as if it were a person, to say, this city, in the case of Coventry, destroyed in the war, bombed completely, what does that do to you as you think about your now and your future? How has that etched itself into your imagination? And the way we do that is perhaps quite simplistic, but we have a sort of scale and nothing's perfect. And each of these scales, it says introvert, extrovert. Well, each has certain qualities. Neither is completely good or completely bad. To be self absorbed or agreeable and disagreeable are two things. It doesn't mean it's all negative. To be conscientious and spontaneous are both qualities that we need. To be curious is important, but perhaps also driven. To be integrated is, of course, incredibly vital. But you need sometimes to go into your silo to look at something in detail. But we also need to combine being practical and idealistic, I believe, at least. So, what we do is we get the feedback from people who answer all of these questions, and then we give a sort of analysis. It's not perfect, but what it does, it just gives a way of having a conversation about your place that's different from the normal way we do things. So, that brings me to more or less a final point, which is about the public administration. And I, with colleagues, invented a festival based on a book of mine called The Creative Bureaucracy and its radical common sense. We organized a big festival around that to highlight the great examples that people are doing in the way they manage things, the way often trapped by systems, as we all know, and that how these need to be loosened up. And we celebrate these unsung heroes who are changing the way systems work to make them feel more about the people around us and so on. So it is about thinking about regulations for today and tomorrow and shifting them in one way or another. So this is a picture from the opening session in our last fifth festival on the 15th of June this year. And perhaps you'll join us next year too. So we live clearly in scary times. And so the question is, can these times become more interesting, more exciting? I hope they can. And I hope all of us probably hope they can. So, and therefore we could be perhaps more joyful and celebratory, and also fight against ugliness. And I think we should reintroduce the word beauty more into our conversation. It's an old-fashioned word. We can argue about what it is, but I still think it's important. And I suppose even these old guys are quite interested in that. I hope they are. So my conclusion is that the soft is the hard. A lot of what we're talking about is hard, it's invisible, and so on. So therefore, I leave you and thank you so much.